All right, guys, so we're back into chapter 20 here, looking at the start of the Cold War and what is going on in Europe, specifically after the end of World War II. Notice how there's a lot going on in this chapter. We go all the way from Nuremberg to missile races to Hungarian revolts. There's a lot going on here, so just bear with it, bear with the content, and we'll try to explain it as best we can. Where we left off last time was really just the start of the Cold War, what I've defined as the actual beginning event of the Cold War, which was the Berlin blockade. A blockade, for all practical purposes, is an international act of war. So when the Soviet Union blockades Berlin, we would consider that an international act of war. It's not a declaration of war, but it still is an act of war. Okay, it creates a second Red Scare, led kind of by this guy Joseph McCarthy, a senator in the United States, and basically we're in a very quickly after World War II a period of intense escalation in tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. In the meantime, Joseph Stalin is still the premier of the Soviet Union, and he is going to increase his control in this area, leading to economic reconstruction, huge amount of devastation and destruction from World War II, lots of wartime damage, so a lot of construction is going to be needed to rebuild parts of the Soviet Union. Not only that, but it will lead to massive amounts of military spending, also massive arrests of any political prisoners. And actually, it's these prisoners who are working to rebuild the economy, basically for free labor. This is kind of slavery in a way, right? If you arrest people and force them to work, that's slavery. So anyway, who's rebuilding the Soviet Union? It is prisoners, slaves, right? Also, right before Stalin's death, he gets pretty paranoid and decides that Jews are behind some sort of plot to marginalize his control of the government. And if he had stayed alive much longer, he probably would have deported many of those Jews to Siberia after the war. So not necessarily very sensitive to the horrors of the Holocaust, even though the Soviets were the first to liberate the concentration camps. President Harry S. Truman will set up a new organization known as NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. And this was basically a military alliance system with all the Western democracies. It is an alliance system, right? Just like we have alliances before World War I, except it's really, really big. And it's basically always going to be overseen by a U.S. military general. In the beginning, it's going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower. But members of NATO include many, many Western European powers, including the UK and France, the two major other allies from World War II. And other small states like Iceland, Greece, and Turkey will be entered in, especially as they continue to struggle with Soviet influence in the Balkan area, and even Italy will join later on. Once again, the commander of this is going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower. And as you can imagine, the Soviets aren't very excited about the formation of NATO, right? This massive military group right to the west of them, west of the Iron Curtain. And so what the Soviets do is increase the size of their army to a point where it outnumbered all troops in Europe whatsoever. And the idea was that it didn't matter if the U.S. was there or not, or oversaw NATO. The Soviet Union could overrun Western Europe whenever they wanted to if there was a war. They also create their own arsenal of atomic weapons. First, just a basic atomic bomb, and then a hydrogen bomb. And as a result of these military developments, we have a new series of events, really known as the arms race, in which both the Soviet Union and the United States try to out-jockey each other for command of nuclear technology and missile technology. The U.S. detonated its first hydrogen bomb in 1952, so hydrogen bombs are incredibly more destructive than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, really up to 20 to 30 times more destructive at this point. The Soviet Union, who had already had economic power, detonates their own later in 1953. And as a result of both powers realizing that they have the ability to destroy each other many times over, you would think, well, maybe there should be kind of like this spirit of we're not going to use them, right? Like, if we do have military conflict, we'll kind of pledge not to use them. Well, that's not the case. U.S. military policy is known as massive retaliation, which meant that if there was any sort of Soviet attack, the United States would send their full nuclear arsenal at the Soviet Union through atomic weapons, in order to make sure that the Soviet Union was destroyed forever. And the truth is, as we go through the arms race throughout the 1950s and then into the 1960s, the United States really can launch nuclear missiles from almost any point at all in the world, from Europe, from mainland United States, from Turkey. We're going to have 15 Jupiter missiles from there, even in Asia, right? But the only place the Soviet Union could launch an attack would be over the North Pole, and those nuclear bombs could be detected by radar from Canada. So, we definitely have a superior position in terms of technology and position, geographical position, in relation to the Soviets. West Germany will enter NATO shortly after this. They rearm, all right? So pretty quickly, within 10 years, they're able to rearm in response to the Soviet military ballooning. 1955, the Soviets formed what is known as the Warsaw Pact, which is the response to NATO, right? And this was a military alliance of all Eastern European nations underneath Soviet command. So it really is NATO, the same thing, just for communist nations in Eastern Europe. The Soviets recognized East Germany as an independent state, and officially Germany will be divided into two separate nations. East Germany, however, is not necessarily compelled to sit inside of Soviet control. And in fact, in 1953, 450 towns in East Germany rebel. They are upset with living conditions relative to their countrymen in West Germany, and they also are looking forward to the era where Stalin is gone. So there's this sense that when Stalin is gone, that potentially there'll be more wiggle room for expression, for building up German greatness, for economic recovery, etc. And so there's this whole push of, if Stalin's not going to go away right now, then we'll just make sure that happens. So East Germans aren't necessarily super pumped about living inside of the Soviet orbit. Biggest rebellion, though, in this time period will be after Stalin dies in Hungary in 1956. Demonstrators want Soviet troops to leave. Many think that as a result of rebelling that the U.S. would intervene, but the U.S. will not intervene because the Soviet Union made it very clear if they did, they would definitely be at war, and the United States is not going to go to war over Eastern Europe at this point. We would over Western Europe, but not Eastern. The Soviets will crush the rebellion under new leader Nikita Khrushchev, and 25,000 Hungarians will die. Period there. Now, it's not all bad during this time period. I've certainly painted a grim portrait, but actually we're going to have, after Stalin's death in 1953, a thaw in the Cold War. Okay, a new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, will come to power in '53, and he basically throws Stalin under the bus. He says all of his policies were crap. He really is critical of the Great Terror that took place in the '30s. He'll free millions from prison camps, try to improve living conditions, and increase agricultural output, right? To do all this, he, of course, limits military spending. So here is a guy in Khrushchev that is willing to tear down, the prospect of an army that could annihilate all of Western Europe in order to take care of his own people, right? Which is going to catch on, and it's going to be actually very necessary because Russia doesn't know what to do without Stalin. Remember, Stalin's been in power since the late 1920s, and this is over 25 years, right? Where the only leader has been Stalin, and really, this Bolshevik experiment has been completely dominated by Stalin's presence. Okay, and that's what we actually call the type of communism he institutes Stalinism, right? Because it's his particular brand or flavor of communism. Khrushchev is quite different. Okay, in the meantime, in the United States, we'll have a transition of leadership in '53 from Truman to Eisenhower. So the same year, we get new leaders both in the United States and in the Soviet Union. And their relationship is much better. They're willing to negotiate more than the predecessors. The media will not portray the Soviets as these, psycho, terror, backwards murderers, right? Like it's more of a balanced approach. Khrushchev will even come to America, come in to visit in America. Actually really wants to go to Disneyland, but can't get in because of security problems. Anyway, so there's this idea that maybe citizens in the United States, including the presidents and the premiers and citizens of the Soviet Union, have a little bit of an area to dialogue, to talk. And that is really the extent of the thaw, right? Just being able to talk, just being able to voice concerns and find some common overlap instead of threatening to launch nuclear bombs back and forth. At the same time, though, the missile races are not done. The arms races are not done. And what really causes a change in posturing for Khrushchev is in 1957 when he uses a rocket, all right, to launch Sputnik, which is the first satellite into orbit around the Earth. Okay. They had also launched an ICBM, also known as an intercontinental ballistic missile, right? Which is a long-range missile up to thousands of miles versus a short-range ballistic missile, SRBM. And this starts the missile age, right? The U.S. Is way behind in terms of missile technology. They're pissed, they're afraid, and basically a missile gap is declared between the U.S. and the Soviets. Eisenhower will create an administration known as NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, in order to not just increase the United States space presence, okay, but really what it's created for is to develop missiles that can launch things across the world, right? And then potentially these things are going to be nuclear warheads. So the idea is that we actually need to create NASA to check the missile technology and the ability of the Soviet Union to blow us up with nuclear bombs from thousands of miles away. The U.S. closes this gap pretty quickly. By 1962 and 63, the U.S. is going to have 450 missiles and 2,000 bombers. Okay, and these can all strike the Soviet Union from thousands of miles away. And then we have a new phrase, of course, known as the balance of terror, right? That describes the ability of both sides to destroy each other completely, right? It would be complete nuclear annihilation. Here's a picture, by the way, of Sputnik. Kind of looks like a little alien robot, but this was it. This is the first satellite in orbit, okay? This plane right here is what is known as a U-2 spy plane, and we'll talk about this in a minute. It's going to cause even more tension between the two. And actually, one more picture I never explained before is the map of NATO countries. Okay, NATO countries are going to be in the light blue here. You can see all of them more or less here, right? So you can see that all the NATO countries are mostly Western Europe, all right, and including Turkey and Greece down here in the south. Okay. Anyway, missile races. Where do we go from here? All right. So despite détente, we're going to actually get closer. Sorry, despite the thaw in the Cold War, we're not quite at détente yet. Despite the thaw in the Cold War, we'll get closer to nuclear war in the early 1960s than any other point in U.S. history before or since. And this is all precipitated by Cuba. Okay, but before that, in 1960, the Soviets would shoot down a U-2 spy plane, a U.S. U-2 spy plane. These planes are capable of flying 12 to 14 miles above the Earth. They can actually take a picture of a golf ball from that height. So it's pretty amazing. They're not easily detectable on radar. They're not easy to shoot down 14 miles above the Earth. Usually most planes fly between 30 and 35,000 feet above the Earth, which is 6 to 7 miles. Anyway, so these are flying basically double, right? And they're very, very hard to detect. But the Soviets catch one, they shoot it down, they say it's violating Soviet airspace. Khrushchev demands an apology. Eisenhower refuses to do this, okay? And basically, despite all of this thaw, we're in a place where tensions are ramped up. We get a new president, John F. Kennedy, He was elected in 1960. Very similar to Truman in three ways. He's a tough political battler. He's a believer in containment, and he puts advisors around him that want to contain Soviets and that will be tough on the Soviets. Okay, so he comes in trying to be tenacious, and we see here this kind of arm wrestling match with here's Khrushchev on the left, Kennedy on the right, arm wrestling with while they sit in their nuclear missiles, right? And we're set up for a scene where Kennedy will try to insert his strength, and Khrushchev isn't buying it. Okay, and we'll see where that leads. JFK replaces the policy of massive retaliation with a new policy of, quote, flexible response. This basically is just the idea that instead of just blowing each other up on every side, maybe it's wiser to build up traditional components of the military, like the Army, Navy, and Marines, to fight in limited wars. And this policy will be continued, okay? This is how the United States will fight going forward in the 20th century, in limited wars and proxy wars, right? Not with nuclear warheads, okay? He also helps to found the Peace Corps, okay, which brings educational and technological skills to poor nations, right? So this is kind of an altruistic extension of American power to the developing world, okay? And it's even still today very active across the whole world, and is actually one of the greatest accomplishments of the Kennedy administration. In his first couple years of being in office, Kennedy will be heavily tested by Khrushchev, all right? Khrushchev had threatened to take over all of Berlin in 1960 if the U.S. didn't demilitarize it, right? In other words, get all its tanks and weapons out of it. And he kind of, is pushing to see, will we call his bluff? Will he not? And, Kennedy, of course, is not going to withdraw anything. Khrushchev kind of gradually delays taking over Berlin. At the same time, East Germans are fleeing Berlin in literally the hundreds of thousands, right? 1960 alone, 125,000 East Germans will flee to West Berlin and then to West Germany, escaping the Soviet system. This is where Khrushchev decides that it's time to build a wall, and he pulls and builds up the Berlin Wall in August 1961. Okay, and this, when it falls, will signal the end of the communist system, right? And it's kind of been seen as the symbol of repression and the failure of communism ever since. Second major confrontation, as I mentioned, is in Cuba. We get a change in leadership in Cuba in the 1950s. It had been controlled by Fulgencio Batista, an ally of the U.S. and friend of U.S. businesses, including sugar refining and gambling. And basically is overthrown in 1959 by the communist Fidel Castro, all right, and also Che Guevara. And we'll go over exactly how this happens in further chapters. But just know that this causes a massive break in foreign policy regarding Latin America for the United States. Previously, if you remember, the United States backed governments, sometimes dictators, that supported U.S. business interests in order to preserve economic imperialism inside of Latin America. Okay, but Fidel Castro, okay, he's not necessarily a communist right out of the gate, but he moves towards Marxist principles, right? And these include nationalizing domestic and foreign corporations and creating social reform programs. But he's not necessarily firmly in 1959 in the arms of the Soviet powers. The United States, though, doesn't like the fact that Castro is fermenting a revolution down in Latin America, and we basically boycott all Cuban sugar production, okay? Thinking that will cripple the Cuban economy, right? Their major export is sugar, and a major buyer of that sugar is going to be the United States. Well, Castro doesn't buy it. He just continues to nationalize U.S. businesses and moves to the USSR. And actually, the USSR will say, that's great. We'll buy all your sugar, even if we don't need it. We'll just buy it, right? Because we're fine with having an ally inside of the Western Hemisphere, right? This is actually a violation of the Monroe Doctrine if the Soviets truly push and create kind of this like tick in the middle of the Western Hemisphere. 1960, the U.S. breaks down diplomatic relationships with Cuba, and the CIA will be authorized to train anti-Castro Cubans for the purpose of invading Cuba and getting rid of Castro. Okay, sure enough, in April 1961, right after Kennedy becomes president, these forces invade Cuba at what we call the Bay of Pigs, and it's an abject failure. Peasants do not come to the aid of these forces. Kennedy does not order air support, right, which is considered a major blunder because that probably could have saved them. And as a result, this group will surrender in a couple of days. This will hurt the reputation of Kennedy. All right, he'll look weak as a result of this. But after this initial blunder, he's going to change his posture and get tough on the Soviets, even if it includes full-scale war in Cuba. Khrushchev, of course, watches this happen, and considers Kennedy a weak leader. And he says, you know what? If you're as weak as I think you are, then I'm just going to send in bombers and missiles to Cuba, medium-range bombers, so not ICBMs, but medium-range. These could hit cities in the U.S. like Washington, D.C., though. Okay, it's similar to the missiles that we put in Turkey, right? That are pretty close to Moscow, right? So this is basically a tit-for-tat retribution for the fact that we have missiles in Turkey. The U.S. finds these sites in Cuba, and here's actually a picture of one of these, of us discovering what's going on here. And this is discovered by U-2 spy planes, and we have what is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis that comes out of this. The U.S. says, get all of your bombers and nuclear warheads out of Cuba, or we're going to invade. Simple as that, right? We're going to have war. Kennedy will impose a blockade or a quarantine of Cuba. This is also, like the Berlin blockade, an international act of war, right? And we have this period of almost a week where both powers are basically posturing themselves back and forth to see who will back down first. And what's crazy about this, actually, if you watch some movies about this, there's no direct telephone line between the two, Khrushchev and Kennedy. So there's no actual clear communication between what's going on. And in fact, it's a Soviet spy that comes into the White House and says, listen, let's work out a deal. Okay, and he had been given a message to talk with Kennedy about ironing out a deal. Khrushchev will end up retreating, and he agrees that he will remove the offending bombers and missiles out of Cuba. In response, though, the U.S. would not invade Cuba, right? And more or less, the Soviets could retain their ally, their communist ally, in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, and that is the end of that crisis. So that gets us firmly into the Cold War, right? I mean, look at this. We're in the early 1960s. We had jumped from 1945 to 1961 here. So a lot of information in this chapter, a lot going on in the early Cold War. And this is just in Europe and the Western Hemisphere. So we haven't even talked yet about the Korean War or what's happening in China. They're fighting a civil war. There's a lot going on in Asia as well. So that's what's coming next. But right now, get your questions done and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks so much.